March 7th, 1945. Captain James Dutch Kinder sat in the briefing room at Schweinfurt Air Base, listening to the intelligence officer describe another massacre. Yesterday, 8 P-51 Mustangs had engaged 4 Messerschmitt Me-262 jets over Munich. The jets had destroyed 5 Mustangs in less than 3 minutes. The remaining 3 P-51 seconds had limped home with battle damage, their pilots shaken, their gun cameras empty of any footage showing hits on the enemy. This was becoming routine. The Luftwaffe's jet fighters were slaughtering Allied aircraft with impunity, and nobody seemed able to stop them. Kinder watched the other pilots in the room. He saw the tension in their shoulders, the way they avoided eye contact when the intelligence officer mentioned the 262's speed advantage. Everyone knew the statistics by now. The Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour. A P-51 Mustang topped out at 440. That 100-mile-per-hour gap might as well have been 1,000. The briefing continued with the same tired advice they'd heard a dozen times before. Catch them during takeoff or landing, hit the airfields, avoid engaging them in the air unless you have overwhelming numerical advantage. Don't chase them. Don't try to turn with them. Don't attempt deflection shooting at high closure rates because your bullets will never catch them. Kinder had heard it all before, and he knew it was inadequate. The 262 seconds weren't just faster. They represented a fundamental shift in aerial combat that made every tactic the Americans had developed obsolete. Traditional dogfighting assumed rough parity in aircraft performance. You could outturn an enemy, outclimb them, use superior pilot skill to compensate for mechanical disadvantages. But the 262 didn't play by those rules. The jets came from above and behind, diving through bomber formations at speeds that made interception mathematically impossible. By the time a P-51 pilot saw the 262, calculated a firing solution, and squeezed the trigger, the German jet was already gone, vanished into the distance, while the Americans' bullets fell uselessly through empty air. Bomber crews were dying, fighter escorts were being humiliated, and headquarters kept issuing the same useless guidance. After the briefing, Kinder walked out to the flight line with his wingman, Lieutenant Bobby Chen. Chen was 22 years old, fresh from stateside training, and terrified of the 262 seconds in a way that the older pilots tried to hide. "You ever see one up close?" Chen asked. Kinder nodded. "Twice. First time was over Nuremberg in January. Came out of nowhere, turned a B-17 into confetti, and disappeared before I could even get my nose pointed at it. Second time was 2 weeks ago. I actually got a shot off. Did you hit it?" "No." Kinder's voice was flat. "My bullets were still climbing when it was already 3 miles away." Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, "So, how do we beat them?" That was the question. How do you beat an enemy that can dictate every aspect of the engagement? The 262 pilot chose when to attack, chose when to break off, chose the altitude, the angle, the distance. American pilots were reduced to reactive targets, hoping the German made a mistake, hoping they got lucky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kinder had been thinking about this problem for weeks. He was a career military pilot, had been flying since before Pearl Harbor, had logged more combat hours than most of the squadron combined. He understood aircraft, understood physics, understood the geometry of aerial combat, and he knew something that the tacticians at headquarters either didn't understand or didn't want to acknowledge. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The P-51 Mustang was an exceptional fighter. It had range, reliability, firepower, and handling characteristics that made it one of the best piston-engine fighters ever built. The problem was doctrine. American fighter tactics had been refined over 3 years of combat against German piston-engine fighters. Those tactics assumed that both aircraft operated within the same basic performance envelope. But the 262 didn't. It existed in a different realm of speed and energy, and beating it required thinking about aerial combat in an entirely different way. Kinder had been studying every gun camera film he could find of 262 engagements. He'd interviewed pilots who'd survived encounters with jets. He'd read intelligence reports from RAF pilots who'd faced them over Germany. And he'd noticed something that nobody seemed to be discussing in the official briefings. The 262, for all its speed, had a weakness. Its turn rate at high speed was relatively poor. The jet's swept wings and heavy weight meant it couldn't turn as tightly as a P-51 at speeds above 400 miles per hour. If you could force a 262 into a turning fight at high speed, you might be able to get inside its turn radius. Position yourself for a deflection shot. But there was a catch. The only way to turn tight enough at those speeds was to use every bit of control authority the P-51 offered. Ailerons, elevator, and rudder, all working together in coordination. The manual called it coordinated flight. You banked with the ailerons, pitched with the elevator, and used just enough rudder to keep the aircraft's nose pointed where you wanted it while minimizing sideslip. It was smooth, efficient, and textbook correct. It was also too slow for engaging a jet. Kinder had been experimenting with something different, something that violated every principle of proper flying technique he'd been taught. Aggressive rudder application during high-speed turns. Not coordinated rudder, not gentle correction. Full deflection, forcing the aircraft into a side slip, using the rudder to yaw the nose around faster than the ailerons alone could manage. It was crude. It was violent. It created enormous drag. It put tremendous stress on the airframe. And according to the technical manual for the P-51, it was prohibited above 300 miles per hour due to risk of structural failure. The manual was very clear on this point. Excessive rudder input at high speed could cause rudder over-control, potentially leading to vertical stabilizer failure. There were documented cases of aircraft breaking apart when pilots applied too much rudder during high-speed combat maneuvering. The engineers who wrote the manual had good reasons for the prohibition. The rudder was a large control surface located far from the aircraft's center of gravity. At high speed, aerodynamic forces on that surface were enormous. Apply too much rudder too quickly, and you could generate enough yaw moment to exceed the structural limits of the vertical stabilizer. The tail could twist, buckle, or separate entirely. Kinder understood the risk. He also understood that following the manual meant watching more bombers get slaughtered while fighter escorts flew helpless circles around aircraft they couldn't catch. He'd been practicing the technique during training flights for 2 weeks. Short bursts of aggressive rudder during high-speed turns. Not enough to break the aircraft, but enough to feel how it responded, to learn the limits, to develop an instinct for how much was too much. The Mustang didn't like it. The whole aircraft shuddered when he stomped on the rudder pedal at 400 miles per hour. He could feel the tail shaking, could hear the airframe creaking, but the nose came around faster. Significantly faster. Fast enough that he could turn inside his wingman's aircraft when they practiced mock combat. Fast enough that he might, possibly, be able to turn inside a 262. He hadn't told anyone what he was doing. The other pilots would have thought he was crazy. The squadron commander would have grounded him for violating technical directives. The engineering officer would have written him up for risking a $50,000 aircraft on a stunt that the manual explicitly prohibited. But on March 8th, everything changed. The mission was a standard bomber escort. 36 B-17 seconds hitting an industrial complex near Frankfurt, escorted by 48 P-51 seconds from 3 different squadrons. Kinder's flight of 4 Mustangs was positioned high and to the right of the bomber formation, altitude 28,000 feet, cruising at 280 indicated. The controller's voice crackled over the radio at 1,347 hours. Bandits inbound, your 6 o'clock high, estimate 8 aircraft, high-speed closure. Kinder craned his neck, searching the sky above and behind. At first he saw nothing, then caught the glint of sunlight on metal. Small shapes diving from altitude, coming fast. Too fast. Jets, he called. Brake right. The 4 Mustangs banked hard. Kinder pushed the throttle to war emergency power, the Packard Merlin engine's supercharger screaming as it shoved the aircraft toward maximum speed. 420 miles per hour, 430. The airspeed indicator needle climbing. The 262 seconds came through the formation like bullets through paper. Kinder saw one flash past a B-17, its 30mm cannons firing. The bomber's right wing disintegrated, the aircraft rolling into a death spiral. Another jet targeted a P-51 from a different squadron. The Mustang exploded, simply came apart in mid-air as cannon shells found the fuel tanks. Then the jets were past, climbing away, untouchable. Except Kinder wasn't watching them climb. He was watching where they'd be when they came back. Because they would come back. The 262 seconds always made multiple passes. Their pilots, knowing the American fighters couldn't catch them, couldn't threaten them, couldn't do anything except watch. Kinder keyed his radio. "Stay with me. We're going after them." His wingman's voice was uncertain. "Dutch, we can't catch them. We're not going to chase them. We're going to be where they're going to be." The jets had climbed to 35,000 feet and were turning back toward the bomber formation. Kinder watched their flight path, calculated their probable attack angle. They'd come from the sun again, diving from 7 o'clock high, using speed and altitude to slash through the escorts before the Americans could react, unless the Americans were already positioned to intercept. Kinder rolled, inverted and pulled, diving to build speed, while turning to place himself between the jets and the bombers. His airspeed climbed past 450. The Mustang was shaking now, the airframe protesting the speed, but he held the dive, building energy, positioning himself. The 262 seconds came in exactly as he'd predicted. 4 aircraft in a loose echelon, diving at a 45-degree angle, their pilots focused on the bombers ahead. They didn't see Kinder's flight climbing to meet them until it was too late to avoid the merge. Kinder pulled up into their path. The lead 262 tried to brake left. That's when Kinder did what the manual said never to do. At 430 miles per hour, he stomped full left rudder while cranking the stick over. The Mustang's nose yawed violently to the left, the aircraft shuddering as it side-slipped through the air, drag skyrocketing, the whole tail assembly groaning under stress that the engineers never intended it to endure. But the nose came around, fast, faster than the 262 pilot expected, faster than a Mustang should have been able to turn at that speed. Kinder's gunsight pipper swept across the jet's fuselage. He pressed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns fired, sending 3,600 rounds per minute into a stream of lead that intersected the 262's flight path. Hits sparkled across the jet's right engine. White smoke erupted, then flame. The 262 rolled right, whether from pilot input or control damage, Kinder couldn't tell. He released the rudder, let the Mustang recover from its violent sideslip, and immediately looked for the next target. The other 3 jets had scattered. One was climbing away at full throttle. One had broken right and was diving toward the deck. The third was turning left, its pilot apparently trying to engage. That pilot made a fatal mistake. He'd slowed down, probably to tighten his turn. Probably thinking he could reverse on the P-51. Kinder met him head-on. Both aircraft closing at combined speed exceeding 700 miles per hour. The 262's cannons fired first, but at that closure rate, with that deflection angle, the shells went wide. Kinder waited until the range closed to 800 feet, then stomped right rudder and fired. The violent yaw put his guns on target for less than half a second, but half a second at that range was enough. The 262's canopy shattered. The aircraft pitched up violently, then snap-rolled and tumbled out of control. Kinder flashed past it, pulled up to avoid collision, and realized his airspeed had dropped to 280. He'd bled off 150 miles per hour in that engagement. The aggressive rudder inputs, the violent maneuvering, the drag from side-slipping through the air had cost him all his energy, which meant if there were more jets, he was now vulnerable. But when he looked around, the sky was empty except for his wingmen and the bombers. The other 262 seconds had fled. 2 jets destroyed, the rest scattered. And the bombers were still flying, still heading toward target. Chen's voice came over the radio, shaking with adrenaline. "How the hell did you do that?" Kinder didn't answer. He was too busy checking his aircraft for damage. The tail felt loose, mushy. When he applied rudder now, the response was sluggish. He'd stressed something back there, possibly bent the vertical stabilizer, possibly damaged the rudder control system. He'd have to nurse the aircraft home, hope nothing broke before he could get wheels on the ground. But he'd done something nobody thought was possible. He'd engaged me 262 jets in aerial combat and won, not by catching them on takeoff, not by hitting their airfields, not by getting lucky, by fighting them in the air, using technique that every manual said was prohibited, using tactics that violated every principle of safe flying. That evening, the engineering officer inspected Kinder's Mustang. The vertical stabilizer had stress cracks. The rudder hinges showed signs of deformation. The entire tail section would need to be replaced. "What the hell did you do to this aircraft?" the engineer asked. Kinder told him about the aggressive rudder technique, about violating the high-speed restriction, about deliberately side-slipping at 430 miles per hour. The engineer stared at him like he'd admitted to sabotage. Kinder said, "But I got 262 seconds. The engineer opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Because that was the point, wasn't it? The technique was dangerous, violated protocols, stressed the aircraft beyond design limits. But it worked. It worked when nothing else did. Word spread fast. That night, pilots from other squadrons came to Kinder's tent, asking questions. How much rudder? How fast? What's the recovery technique? Could it work with other aircraft? Kinder explained it as best he could, but he knew the technique couldn't be taught from description. It had to be felt, practiced, internalized, and it required accepting a level of risk that most pilots weren't comfortable with. The squadron commander called Kinder into his office the next morning. "I heard what you did yesterday." "Yes, sir." "The engineering officer says you violated technical limitations." "Yes, sir. He says you should be grounded pending investigation." Kinder said nothing. The commander looked at him for a long moment. "He also says you got 2 confirmed kills against 262 seconds, using a technique nobody else has managed to make work." The commander leaned back in his chair. 8th Air Force has lost 42 aircraft to jets in the last 2 weeks. 42. Our best pilots can't touch them. Our best tactics don't work. We're losing bombers, losing escorts, and headquarters keeps telling us to be patient, wait for our own jets to arrive. He paused. "But you found a way." "It's risky," Kinder admitted. "The aircraft isn't designed for it. War is risky," the commander said. "Aircraft can be replaced. Pilots are harder to replace. Pilots who can kill jets are damn near irreplaceable." He pulled out a folder. "I'm authorizing you to train a volunteer group in your technique. Pilots who understand the risk, who want to learn. We'll use aircraft that are already scheduled for major maintenance, so if you break something, we're not losing combat capability." Kinder nodded slowly. "How many pilots?" "As many as want to learn." "But Dutch?" "Both of us. Make sure they understand what they're getting into." Over the next 3 days, Kinder trained 11 pilots in the aggressive rudder technique. He started with classroom instruction, explaining the physics, the limitations, the risks. Then he took each pilot up individually, demonstrating the technique, letting them feel what happened when you stomped the rudder at high speed. 3 pilots washed out immediately, too uncomfortable with how violent the maneuver felt, how much the aircraft protested. The remaining 8 practiced until they could execute the technique reliably, without overstressing the airframe. On March 12th, they got their chance to prove it worked. The mission briefing on March 12th was routine. Bomber escort to Munich, targeting the BMW engine plant. Intelligence suggested minimal opposition. The Luftwaffe was conserving fuel, husbanding its remaining aircraft. Resistance would likely be light. Intelligence was wrong. The formation reached Munich at 1,520 hours. Altitude 26,000 feet. Weather clear. Visibility unlimited. Perfect conditions for precision bombing. The controller's voice was urgent. Multiple bandits, 6 o'clock high, estimate 12 aircraft, high-speed closure, probable jets. Kinder's pulse quickened. 12. The largest formation of 262 seconds anyone had seen in a single engagement. Jagdverband 44, Adolf Gallen's elite jet unit, was committing everything they had. This wasn't harassment. This was an all-out attempt to break the bomber formation. All Mustang flights, this is Dakota lead. Trained pilots, you're with me. Everyone else, standard defensive formation. Kinder's voice was calm, but his mind was racing through calculations. 12 jets versus 8 P-51 seconds that could use the prohibited technique. The odds were terrible. But if they didn't engage, the jets would massacre the bombers. The 8 Mustangs that had trained in Kinder's technique formed up, tight. They climbed toward the incoming jets, trading altitude for position, accepting that they'd lose the energy advantage in exchange for being in the right place when the 262 seconds came through. The jets appeared as silver flashes against the blue sky. 12 aircraft in 3 flights of 4, staggered formation, diving at 60 degrees. Their pilots knew what they were doing. This wasn't a hasty intercept. This was a coordinated strike by experienced pilots flying the most advanced fighters in the world. The first flight of 262 seconds went for the bombers. Kinder let them pass. Chasing jets from behind was futile. Instead, he watched the second flight, 4 aircraft diving from 7 o'clock, their trajectory bringing them through the bomber formation from left to right. Kinder rolled inverted and pulled, diving to intercept. His airspeed climbed. 380. 400. 420. The Mustang was shaking, the controls stiffening as ram air pressure increased. The lead 262 was focusing on a B-17, the jet's 30mm cannons tracking toward the bomber's cockpit. Kinder judged angles, closure rate, deflection. The geometry was wrong. He was too far behind, too low. A standard pursuit curve would put him 300 yards behind the jet when it finished its pass and accelerated away. Useless. So he did something the jet pilot wouldn't expect. At 430 miles per hour, Kinder chopped throttle, extended speed brakes, and simultaneously stomped full left rudder while cranking the stick hard over. The Mustang's nose yawed violently left as the aircraft decelerated and side-slipped. The maneuver was aerodynamically horrific. Drag spiked. The airframe groaned. But the nose came around 90 degrees in less than 2 seconds. The 262 flashed across Kinder's windscreen, crossing from left to right at 600 feet range. Kinder fired. The closing angle was almost perpendicular. His bullets didn't need to chase the jet. They just needed to fill the space the jet was about to occupy. Tracers converged on the 262's left engine. Metal fragments sprayed. The engine nacelle erupted in orange flame. The jet rolled right, trailing fire and smoke. Its pilot ejected at low altitude. The parachute barely had time to deploy before the pilot hit the ground. Kinder didn't watch. He was already recovering from his violent sideslip, retracting speed brakes, advancing throttle, looking for the next threat. His wingman, Chen, had engaged a different jet. Kinder saw the Mustang execute the same aggressive rudder snap, watched Chen's tracers walk across a 262's fuselage. The jet pitched down violently and dove toward the deck, streaming fuel. Chen didn't follow. He'd learned the lesson. Don't chase. Stay with the bombers. The third flight of 262 seconds was turning back for another pass. 4 aircraft, still in formation, climbing for altitude before their next attack run. They'd seen 2 of their comrades go down. But they weren't breaking off. Jagdverband 44 pilots were fanatics. They'd keep attacking until they ran out of ammunition or fuel. Kinder keyed his radio. Dakota flight, form on me. We're going after them. Dutch, they're climbing away. That was Lieutenant Morrison, one of the newly trained pilots. We can't catch them in a climb. We're not climbing after them. We're going to be where they're coming from. Kinder understood something about jet tactics that most pilots missed. The 262 had tremendous speed and acceleration in a dive, but it was relatively poor in a sustained climb. The Junkers Jumo engines, while revolutionary, lacked the thrust-to-weight ratio for vertical performance. A 262 pilot climbing from low altitude to set up another attack run was vulnerable. Not slow, but not untouchable. Kinder led his flight in a climbing turn, positioning them between the jets and the sun. If the 262 pilots were focused on the bomber formation below, they might not see the P-51 seconds above until too late. The 4 jets leveled off at 30,000 feet and began their turn back toward the bombers. Kinder was at 28,000, 1,000 feet below, and a mile to their right. The angle was perfect. He rolled inverted and pulled, diving to build speed while turning toward the jet's projected flight path. His airspeed climbed past 400. The 4 P-51 seconds in his flight followed, maintaining formation, trusting his lead. The 262 seconds entered their attack dive. They still hadn't seen the Mustangs. Kinder pulled up into their path. The closure rate was insane, both formations converging at combined speed exceeding 900 miles per hour. The lead 262 saw them at the last moment and tried to brake left. Kinder led the turn, stomped left rudder, felt the Mustang yaw violently. His gunsight pipper tracked across the jet's canopy. He fired. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The 262's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled right, out of control. Chen took the second jet, his tracers shredding the right engine. Morrison got the third with a deflection shot that nobody who hadn't trained in the technique could have made. The fourth jet pilot did the smart thing. He broke off, dove straight down at full throttle, and fled. 3 jets down in less than 30 seconds. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining 262 seconds from the first and second flights had completed their attacks on the bombers and were climbing back for altitude. 6 aircraft, still dangerous, still capable of breaking the formation. Kinder's flight was now low on energy. They'd burned speed in their attack, bled altitude in their intercepts. The Mustangs needed to climb back to escort position, but climbing meant being vulnerable. Chen called out, "More bandits, 4 o'clock level, 3 aircraft." 3 262 seconds that had somehow reformed, probably the survivors from the initial attack runs. They were 5 miles out, turning toward the P-51 seconds, recognizing that the American fighters were now separated from the bomber formation and vulnerable. This was the moment the jet pilots had been trained for, isolated enemy fighters at a speed and altitude disadvantage. But Kinder saw something the jet pilots didn't. One of the 262 seconds was trailing thin white smoke, not engine fire, but fuel vapor. That jet had been damaged earlier, probably by defensive fire from a bomber's gunners. Its pilot was still fighting, but the aircraft was wounded. Kinder made a split-second decision. Dakota 2 and 3, engage the damaged bandit. 4 and 5, you're with me on the other 2. He turned toward the 2 undamaged jets head-on. Everything in fighter pilot training said, you don't engage jets head-on. The closure rate is too high. Your bullets can't reach them before they pass. But Kinder wasn't planning a standard head-on attack. The 262 seconds were in a slight right echelon, the wingman positioned, about 500 feet to the right of the leader. Standard formation for mutual support. The wingman could cover the leader's 6, and both aircraft could bring guns to bear on targets ahead. Kinder flew straight at the leader, not deviating, making the German pilot think this was a standard head-on pass. Both aircraft would fire, both would miss at that closure rate, both would flash past each other and escape. Except at the last moment, Kinder didn't fire. Instead, at 400 miles per hour and 300 yards range, he executed his rudder snap. Full left rudder, full left stick, the Mustang yawing and rolling simultaneously. The maneuver threw the aircraft perpendicular to its original flight path, the nose swinging 90 degrees left in under 2 seconds. The lead 262 flashed past Kinder's right wing, exactly as planned. But the wingman was now directly ahead, less than 200 yards, his aircraft momentarily exposed by the formation's spacing. Kinder fired. Point-blank range, no deflection, pure snapshot shooting. His 650s converged on the 262's nose. The jet's windscreen exploded, the canopy disintegrated. The aircraft pitched up violently as the pilot, either dead or incapacitated, lost control. The 262 tumbled, shedding parts, breaking up from structural stress. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. Dakota 5 got the damaged one. Splash one. Chen followed up. Dakota 2, confirmed kill on one of the reformed flight. That's 6 down. Kinder recovered from his rudder snap and climbed. His airspeed had dropped to 240. He was dangerously slow, vulnerable. He advanced throttle to war, emergency power, and pulled for altitude. The remaining 262 seconds were scattered across 10 miles of sky, their formation broken, their coordinated attack disrupted. Then Kinder saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 more 262 seconds, fresh aircraft, diving from altitude toward the bomber formation. These weren't from the original group. These were reinforcements, probably scrambled from a nearby airfield when the first attack began. The American fighters were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and exhausted from 7 minutes of continuous combat. But the bombers were still there, still flying their bombing runs, still vulnerable. Kinder checked his fuel gauge. 8 minutes of fighting time remaining at combat power, maybe 10 at cruise. His ammunition counter showed 400 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. Enough for maybe 5 seconds of firing. Dakota flight, form on me. We've got 2 more coming in. Lieutenant Harris, Dakota 4, responded. Dutch. We're Winchester. I'm out of ammo, Morrison added. I've got maybe 3 seconds of trigger time left. Chen said nothing, which meant he was in the same situation. They were spent, exhausted, running on fumes and adrenaline. The smart move was to break off, let the 2 fresh jets make their pass, hope the bombers' defensive fire could drive them off. Kinder looked at the bomber formation. 36, B-17 seconds, 360 men, flying straight and level, through flak, through fighters, through hell itself to put bombs on target. Those men couldn't maneuver, couldn't run, could only trust that their escorts would keep the jets away. We stay, Kinder said. Even if we're dry, we make them think we're a threat. The 262 seconds were diving from 8 o'clock high, setting up for a classic slashing attack. Kinder turned to intercept, his remaining wingmen forming up beside him. 4 P-51 seconds, mostly unarmed, low on fuel, facing 2 fresh jets flown by pilots who'd watched 7 of their comrades go down in the last 8 minutes. Those German pilots had to be wondering what the hell had happened. Their unit was Jagdverband 44, the elite of the elite. They flew the most advanced fighters in the world. They'd been trained by aces, led by legends. And they were getting slaughtered by obsolete piston engine fighters, using a technique that shouldn't work. The lead 262 adjusted his dive, targeting Kinder directly. The German pilot had seen enough. He wasn't going after the bombers anymore. He wanted the American who'd killed 7 of his unit. This was personal. Kinder accelerated to meet him. 400 miles per hour. 420. The jet came in fast, cannons firing. Kinder saw the tracers, judged the angle, and waited. At 600 yards, he snapped. Full right rudder this time, throwing the Mustang into a violent sideslip that took him out of the Germans' firing solution. The 262 flashed past, its pilot pulling up hard, trying to regain altitude. Kinder reversed, snapped left, pulled hard, and fired his remaining rounds. He had maybe 2 seconds of ammunition. The tracers arced toward the climbing jet. Most missed. A few sparked off the 262's left wing, not enough to bring it down, but enough to make the pilot flinch, break his climb, roll away. The jet disappeared into clouds, trailing thin smoke, but still flying. Harris engaged the second jet, even though he was Winchester. He flew straight at it, making the German pilot think he was about to get shot. The 262 broke off its attack run, unwilling to risk a head-on pass with an aircraft that might still be armed. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fight was over. The remaining 262 seconds were fleeing, diving for the deck or climbing for altitude, breaking contact. The sky was suddenly quiet, except for the drone of bomber engines and the sound of Kinder's Mustang's engine running rough from 8 minutes at war emergency power. Chen's voice over the radio was shaking. "Dutch? Did that just happen?" Kinder checked the sky one more time, confirming no threats, then keyed his mic. "Dakota flight? Verify kills." "Sound off." The count came in. 7 confirmed jet kills. 3 by Kinder, 2 by Chen, 1 by Morrison, 1 by Harris, plus 1 probable and 2 damaged. 262 seconds had intercepted the formation. 7 were destroyed. 2 were damaged and limped home. 3 escaped intact. The bomber formation dropped their ordnance on target and turned for home. Not a single B-17 had been shot down by the jets. The only losses were 2 bombers damaged by flak, and both made it back to friendly territory. As Kinder's flight landed back at Schweinfurt, fire trucks were waiting. Morrison's Mustang had taken hits from 20mm cannon fire, probably from ground fire during the low-altitude portions of the fight. He made it down safely, but the aircraft was a write-off. Harris had overstressed his airframe during his dry engagement with the second reinforcement jet. The vertical stabilizer showed stress cracks, similar to what Kinder's aircraft had suffered days earlier. The engineering officer was waiting when Kinder climbed out of his cockpit. 7 jets. Confirmed, Kinder said. Gun camera footage should verify. Using the prohibited technique? Yes. The engineer looked at him for a long moment. You know, that's not sustainable. The airframes can't take it. We can't keep replacing tail sections after every engagement. I know, Kinder admitted. But it works. And right now, it's the only thing that works. That evening, the squadron gathered in the officers' mess. Word had spread. 7 confirmed kills against me 262 seconds in 8 minutes. The most successful single engagement against German jets of the entire war. Pilots from other squadrons showed up, asking questions, wanting to learn. The squadron commander stood and called for quiet. I received a message from 8th Air Force headquarters this afternoon. They want a full report on today's engagement. They want to know how we achieved a 7-0 kill ratio against jets. He paused. They're also asking why we're using a technique that violates technical limitations and puts our aircraft at risk of structural failure. The room went quiet. Kinder waited. The commander continued. I told them that Captain Kinder developed a technique that exploits a weakness in the 262's turning performance. I told them it requires precise execution and acceptance of increased risk. And I told them that it's the most effective counter to jet fighters we've discovered. He looked at Kinder. Headquarters is sending a technical team to evaluate the technique. If it can be made safe, if we can modify the aircraft to handle the stress, they want to implement it across all fighter groups. But Kinder knew that wouldn't happen. The war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. The 262 seconds were being grounded by lack of fuel, by damaged airfields, by the disintegration of the Luftwaffe's command structure. By the time any modifications could be engineered and implemented, there wouldn't be any jets left to fight. The technique he'd developed would remain a footnote in history, a dangerous improvisation by one pilot that worked for a brief moment when it was desperately needed, then became obsolete as the war ended and jet versus jet combat rendered the whole question moot. But on March 12th, 1945, in 8 minutes over Munich, that prohibited rudder technique had saved 360 bomber crew lives and proven that human ingenuity could still triumph over technological advantage. On March 15th, 945. 3 days after the Munich engagement, Major Richard Hallstrom, from 8th Air Force Technical Operations, arrived at Schweinfurt. He was an engineer, not a pilot, and he brought with him a team of analysts, photographers, and technical specialists. Their mission was to evaluate Kinder's rudder technique and determine if it could be standardized across the fighter force. Hallstrom watched the gun camera footage from March 12th 3 times. He saw the violent side slips, the aggressive rudder inputs, the way the Mustangs yawed through angles that shouldn't have been possible at those speeds. Then he went out to the flight line and inspected the aircraft that had flown the mission. Harris's P-51 was still there, waiting for a new tail section. The vertical stabilizer showed clear signs of overstress. Metal fatigue cracks radiated from the rudder hinge points. The skin was buckled along the stabilizer's leading edge. Hallstrom ran his hand along the damage. This aircraft was seconds from structural failure, he said. If Lieutenant Harris had executed one more aggressive rudder input, the tail would have separated. Kinder nodded. Probably. And you knew that was a possibility when you developed this technique? Yes. Hallstrom pulled out a notebook. Captain, I need you to understand the position this puts headquarters in. We have a technique that demonstrably works. 7 confirmed kills against an enemy that's been nearly untouchable. But it requires pilots to violate explicit technical limitations and accept a significant risk of catastrophic structural failure. He flipped through his notes. The P-51's vertical stabilizer is rated for a maximum yaw moment of 12,000 foot-pounds at 400 knots. Your technique generates an estimated 18,000 foot-pounds. That's a 50% overload. The engineers who designed this aircraft put those limitations in the manual for good reason. The engineers who designed this aircraft, Kinder replied, never faced me. 262 seconds. They designed for a different war. That doesn't change physics. Metal has stress limits. Exceed them repeatedly, and the structure fails. Hallstrom closed his notebook. I'm recommending against standardizing this technique. The risk is too high. We'd lose more pilots to structural failures than we'd save by shooting down jets. Kinder had expected this. So what do we do? Go back to watching bombers get slaughtered? The jets are already defeated, Hallstrom said. Not by tactics, by logistics. German fuel production has collapsed. They can't keep the 262 seconds flying. The war's almost over. Tell that to the bomber crews who'll die tomorrow when a 262 shows up and we don't have an answer. Hallstrom was quiet for a moment. I can't authorize something that will kill pilots, even if it kills fewer pilots than the alternative. That evening, the squadron held an informal meeting. Pilots who'd trained in Kinder's technique, pilots who'd watched the gun camera footage, pilots who wanted to learn. The question everyone was asking, would headquarters ban the technique entirely? Kinder stood at the front of the room. Major Hallstrom is right about the risk. The technique stresses the airframe beyond design limits. Execute it wrong, execute it too aggressively, and you'll break the aircraft. The tail will separate, and you'll die. He paused. But the alternative is letting jets kill bomber crews while we watch helplessly. So here's what I think. Headquarters will probably issue a directive saying the technique is not authorized. They'll cite safety concerns. They'll reference technical limitations. They'll make it an official order. Morrison spoke up. So we just stop? Go back to standard tactics? No, Kinder said. We keep doing what works. Quietly. Without authorization, because the men in the bombers deserve every advantage we can give them, even if headquarters doesn't approve. This was mutiny, or at least the edge of it, deliberately violating technical directives, ignoring orders from higher command. But every pilot in that room had watched bombers burn. Every one of them had seen B-17 seconds spiral down in flames while fighter escorts circled uselessly, unable to stop the jets. Chen asked the question they were all thinking. What happens if we get caught? Court-martial, Kinder said bluntly. Probably grounded. Possibly prosecuted for willful destruction of government property. Is it worth it? Kinder thought about the 36 bombers that had made it home from Munich, thought about the 360 crew members who were alive because 8 P-51 seconds had used a prohibited technique. Yes, he said. Team departed. They took their footage, their measurements, their recommendations. Kinder never saw the final report, but he heard through unofficial channels that it concluded the technique was too dangerous for general implementation. The recommendation was to continue existing tactics while awaiting deployment of American jet fighters. No official directive was issued prohibiting the technique. Headquarters simply declined to authorize it, which meant it existed in a grey area, not explicitly banned, but not sanctioned. Pilots who used it did so at their own risk, with the understanding that if something went wrong, they'd face consequences. Kinder trained 6 more pilots over the next week. He couldn't train everyone. The technique required a specific combination of physical coordination, aeronautical understanding, and willingness to operate at the edge of structural failure. Most pilots couldn't master it. Some didn't want to try. But those who could learn it, who understood the risks and accepted them, became the squadron's designated jet killers. On March 21st, they proved it again. 8 262 seconds attacked a bomber formation near Nuremberg. 4 P-51 seconds using Kinder's technique intercepted them. 3 jets destroyed, 2 damaged, the rest scattered. No bombers lost to jet attack. On March 24th, another engagement. This time only 2 jets, but both destroyed by pilots using aggressive rudder inputs at speeds the manual said would cause structural failure. The pattern held. When jets attacked and pilots using the prohibited technique were available to intercept, the kill ratio was overwhelmingly in favor of the Americans. When standard tactics were employed, the results were far less favorable. Some pilots noticed and started asking questions. Word spread. Soon, pilots from other squadrons were showing up at Schweinfurt asking for training. Kinder trained them when he could, always with the warning about structural limits, always emphasizing the risks. Some of those pilots would later use the technique in combat. Some would get kills. And at least 2 would die when their aircraft broke apart during aggressive rudder inputs, the tail section separating exactly as the engineers had warned. Those deaths haunted Kinder. He'd trained those pilots. He'd shown them the technique. He'd told them it worked. And they'd died because the metal couldn't handle the stress. But he also knew that if he hadn't trained them, if they'd used standard tactics, they probably would have died anyway. Shot down by jets they couldn't counter, killed by an enemy that could dictate every aspect of the engagement. War forces' impossible choices. Save lives now by taking risks that might kill later. Or play it safe, follow the manual, and watch people die today. Kinder had chosen to accept the risk. By April, the 262 threat was diminishing, not because of tactics, but because Germany's infrastructure was collapsing. Airfields were overrun, fuel supplies evaporated, the Luftwaffe's command structure disintegrated. Jets sat grounded on cratered runways, unable to fly not because they lacked pilots, but because they lacked everything else. Kinder's last engagement with a 262 was on April 18th. A single jet, probably one of the last operational aircraft from Jagdverband 44, attacked a bomber formation near Regensburg. Kinder intercepted, executed his rudder snap at 420 miles per hour, and fired a 3-second burst. The jet's right engine disintegrated. The pilot ejected. The aircraft crashed in a farm field. That was his 12th confirmed jet kill. 12 262 seconds destroyed using a technique that headquarters never authorized, that engineers warned was too dangerous, that violated every principle of safe flying. 12 victories that saved an unknowable number of bomber crew lives. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. By that time, Kinder had received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions over Munich. The citation carefully avoided mentioning his technique, instead noting his exceptional courage and aggressive fighting spirit. It was the military's way of acknowledging his success, while avoiding any official endorsement of methods that violated technical directives. After the war, The Army Air Forces conducted an extensive study of air combat tactics. They interviewed pilots, analyzed gun camera footage, evaluated what worked and what didn't. Kinder's rudder technique was documented in classified reports, studied by engineers, and ultimately filed away. The official conclusion was that the technique exploited temporary vulnerabilities in first-generation jet fighters that would not exist in future aircraft. As jets became more maneuverable, as swept-wing designs improved high-speed handling, the technique would become obsolete. They were right. The MiG-15 seconds and F-86 Sabres that fought over Korea 5 years later could turn aggressively at high speed without the control stiffening that plagued the Me-262. The rudder technique that had worked against German jets would have been useless and suicidal against Soviet designs. But for 3 months in early 1945, against a specific enemy in specific conditions, it had been the answer. The solution that headquarters wouldn't authorize, but that combat pilots needed. Kinder returned to the United States in June 1945. He expected a court-martial for violating technical directives. Instead, he received a promotion to major and orders to test pilot school. The Air Force wanted him to evaluate new jet fighters, to help develop tactics for the coming age of jet combat. He flew F-80, Shooting Stars, tested their handling characteristics, documented their performance. The work was interesting, important, but it lacked the immediacy of combat. Nobody was dying if he made mistakes in a test flight. Nobody's life depended on whether he pushed the aircraft beyond its limitations. Years later, after he'd retired as a colonel, Kinder was interviewed for an Air Force oral history project. The interviewer asked about his 12 victories against Me-262 seconds, asked how he'd developed the technique, asked why he'd been willing to violate technical limitations. Kinder thought about his answer for a long time. "The manual tells you how to fly the aircraft safely," he finally said. "But sometimes safe isn't enough. Sometimes you need to fly it at the edge of what's possible, accept the risks, and trust that your skill will keep you alive." "But you knew pilots died using your technique," the interviewer pressed. "Yes." "Do you regret teaching it?" Kinder was quiet. He thought about the 2 pilots who died, thought about their faces, their names, thought about the bombers that made it home because jets were destroyed, thought about the 360 men who'd walked away from their aircraft at Schweinfurt on March 12th. "I regret that we were in a situation where that technique was necessary," he said. "I regret that we didn't have better aircraft, better tactics, better options. But I don't regret teaching it to pilots who volunteered to learn, who understood the risks, who wanted every possible advantage against an enemy that was killing their friends." The interviewer made notes. The official history says the Me-262 threat was neutralized by targeting their airfields and catching them during takeoff and landing. "That's part of the story," Kinder said. "But it's not the whole story. Some of us learned to fight them in the air. We found their weaknesses. We developed techniques the manual said were impossible. And we proved that human ingenuity, even in obsolete aircraft, could beat advanced technology. By violating the rules. By understanding that the rules were written for different circumstances. The engineers who wrote those technical limitations never imagined we'd be fighting jets. They designed the aircraft for a different war. We adapted it for the war we were actually fighting." The interview ended. The transcript was filed in the Air Force archives. Kinder's story became a footnote in aviation history, occasionally referenced in books about the Me-262, mentioned in studies of tactical innovation, but never widely known. The technique itself was never taught at official military schools. It violated too many principles of safe flying. The risks were too high. And by the time anyone might have standardized it, jets on both sides had evolved to the point where it was obsolete. But for those 3 months in 1945, for those pilots who learned it, who executed it correctly, who accepted the risks and survived, it represented something important. The principle that innovation in combat comes from the bottom up, that soldiers closest to the problem often understand the solution better than headquarters. that sometimes the only way to win is to break the rules. 12. Me 262 seconds, 8 minutes over Munich, a technique that wasn't supposed to work, executed by pilots who weren't supposed to try it, against an enemy that wasn't supposed to be beatable. That was how wars were actually won. Not through grand strategies or political decisions, but through test pilots who found weaknesses, combat pilots who exploited them, and commanders who looked the other way when regulations got in the way of victory. Kinder understood that. He flew 23 combat missions after Munich. He trained 47 pilots in his technique. He wrote reports that were classified for 30 years. He survived the war, raised a family, lived to 83 years old. And every year, on March 12th, he remembered 8 minutes over Munich when obsolete fighters beat an advanced technology because one pilot had been willing to break the rules 12 times and lived to tell about it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.